For those of you who are actually in the room, I do have copies of the book for all of you. They are right downstairs. There's a bit of a spiritual warfare with the copier. I won. It's not a sad story. And a little later on, as we move towards some questions, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about what is said to that point. And in that space, I will run down. So you will certainly get a copy of the book before you leave. I'll even try to bring it not just to the end, so you don't have to stay to the end. So that's coming. Here's what I want to say to you. It was very funny when I was asked to write this book on evangelism. And I was asked to write it, which is different than my first two books. And in the end, I come away really skeptical of things like arranged marriage. I just didn't, I enjoyed writing it, but I want to begin by saying I didn't set out to think I could write a book called What is Evangelism? Or that was something I wanted to do with the kind of evangelism I was doing. But we have a kind of moment happening in the Episcopal Church right now. We have, those of you that still watch the news and watch weather, and they have the map, and there's always some weather person telling you, and there's usually a jet stream kind of going across the whole country. And I just think everything should be called Michael Curry. Because in so many ways, and not just in this country, but definitely in our denomination, I mean, he's sort of a weather system just blowing through. So a lot of the talk about evangelism in our church is a response to being led by a unique evangelist. And I'm not saying he's even unique among presiding bishops. He's just a unique Christian who's leading our church right now. And I'll use an I statement, I am still trying to figure out who he is in relation to what the Episcopal Church is and has been and where we can go together. But to not name that there's something happening, like the Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the other. As a presiding bishop, he's one of these things that's not like the others. And it's an invitation for us with this word evangelism, which he loves and he claims, but I've had a quiet concern for about 2 years now. And my quiet concern is that his uniqueness will quickly become distance to Episcopalians. They will continue, in some ways rightfully so, put him on such a high pedestal, so high, that in fact you won't try to be like that anymore, because who can be like Michael Curry? I know this, I was raised in the Catholic Church, and this is a bit of trivia that if you're not Catholic, maybe this is why, and if you're no longer a Catholic, maybe this is why. But there was a bit of a debate when I was in graduate school studying Catholic theology about the role of Mary approaching the year 2000. And there was in the church an attempt to, led by at that time the head of the what's called the Committee for the Faith, the doctrine people, and the former artist formerly known as Karl Ratzinger, who was that guy, was leading the charge for a new title to be given to Mary at the year 2000 on New Year's Day. And her new title would be in Latin, Co-Redemptrix. Now, even if you just know that rhymes with things in Latin, just take a second to take that in. And it was seen as a revelation, a continued revelation of who Mary really is. She's not just the mother of God, she is co-redemptrix, the co-redeemer of the world. Now, this didn't happen. In the end, the voices for ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, weighed in that let's call Mary a lot of great things on New Year's Day, but not co-redemptrix. And in a bit of shock, the title was never formalized. And our Protestant brothers and sisters, I would say at the time, friends, were quite relieved that what this would do to actually name a woman, at the same time, the ordination of women had been declared infallible teaching. So a lot of people thought these things were going to go together. You could get away with one if you did the other. The mother of God could actually become a co-redeemer, in a sense. But then all this other stuff could also happen because maybe you didn't see what was happening. I say this because it's a study in people who loved Mary, thought there's much to learn from Mary, who almost made her so different that she ceased to be a role model anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you can't aim at being a co-redemptress. That's not a to-do thing. That's not a resolution. That's just like, wow. Literally, that would existentially separate, not the Theotokos, one of us who becomes a God bearer. But literally, that enough Marian dogmas sort of added together would make her actually a different kind of being. Now, I say all this because I get concerned the way a lot of people in the last couple of years, which is why I agreed to write a book on evangelism, the way people are starting to talk about Bishop Curry. I don't hear in their voice that they think they're halfway to that or trying. I'm not even saying they should, but there's this sense that it's just like a light bulb. So I'm concerned that the Episcopal Church right now is playing a bit of Simon Says. And Simon says do this, and we try to do it. And Simon says do that, and we try to do it. And in the end, though, it's not bad because our Simon is an incredible evangelist. But when he steps off the stage, all we've learned to do is do what Simon is doing. I don't know that that's formation. And it certainly isn't if you think you're following Simon, you could never be. So that was one of my concerns. And then it came up that in this particular moment with the Way of Love curriculum coming out, that lets good books in our tradition exist on evangelism. Experts like David Gortner exist on evangelism and many others. But I say him for the people in this community. We still like to say that he's a VTS guy, always. So it's not that books about evangelism haven't been written and haven't been written by Episcopalians about Episcopalians. That's happened. But there is a new moment of evangelism where it looks like, for the first time since perhaps the 80s, we might be talking about evangelism for something other than a response to church decline. That evangelism might, I still don't know, but it might be a moment where we're moving from it as a response, a reaction to decline, to perhaps being its own path of joy, its own way of love, its own vocation that you could talk about and practice and teach and live and die and do and never think once about decline or its relationship to what you're doing. That the life, think of it this way, this soul you save might be your own. You might wake up in the morning and take on the work of evangelism, not as something that's going to save someone else or the church, but as an expression of what's happening to you. We might be at that moment. See, there are all these mights. We might be at that moment. We have a leader who's showing us a lot, but we might be at a moment where we can choose evangelism as a path of freedom. Not from decline, but you personally. So just think about it for a minute. There's this moment we're in, there's a lot of ifs. It'll actually take another presiding bishop ultimately to sort of look back and see what we learned and didn't, what we were reflecting as opposed to what we were being formed in. How much of Michael Curry lets us almost outsource the Episcopal Church's story to a great storyteller and not tell it ourselves, or we might be in a moment where we learn from him to become people who are as effective. We'll get to a minute about what that is. But what I first wanted to start out with, it's been a very busy day here at the seminary for those of you who are actually in the room. In fact, the last 3 hours, God bless all of you who are sitting here. You know, we had church 5 o'clock end of the day, but then Eucharist, and then the eve of Feast of St. Nicholas, and that energy, and then a community dinner, which is always nomadic here. There's tents of meeting and dinners of meeting and whatever. So you've been kind of wandering around. We're in the 3rd floor right now of the building, and the elevator is in Baltimore. So you kind of, it's a journey, and you're here. Congratulations. Thank you. But for a few minutes, I want to do something that is not best practice, and that is to read you something. It's not from my book. Some of you, I hope, have read the Screwtape Letters. If you haven't, sit tight. The Screwtape Letters, so Lewis had the idea to write them in the 40s, and when the Screwtape Letters came out, if you can Google this image if you like, they sold so well in America that he went up on the cover of Time magazine. The only time Lewis was ever on the cover of Time. And there's a drawing of his face, and there's a devil on his shoulder. Little kind of horns. Not as cute as the baby Yoda, but it's cute. I did just buy one for someone at Christmas. But think about it. At a time in America where you actually could get on the cover of Time for writing a book about devils and the Christian faith, and it's just a different era. On the other hand, America was fascinated with this idea, and most of you maybe are familiar with how it works, that there is this, Lewis set out, by the way, to do talks on the radio and wound up not doing them, about what we call best practices in church. And he was very bored by this invitation, and ultimately just didn't take it. And not long after, we find out that he then wrote the Screwtape Letters. And in my head, I've always thought that this was his way of realizing he knew what people wanted said, and he just couldn't bring himself to start listing ways to do church and Christianity. He just felt like he'd already at that point written Mere Christianity, and he just, or did the broadcast talks that would be that. And he just himself was in a very creative place. He was, at that point, had written but was read into other people, his growing love for his own work that he loved what the Chronicles of Narnia were doing. Remember, Lewis's favorite work of his own was his novel Till We Have Faces. If you haven't read it, it's worth a read. Many people don't even know he wrote it. It was his favorite of his works. And for a man who sorry, Twitter, Lewis can be a bit of a chauvinist. He's a man of his time on many issues. But that novel is actually written in a woman's voice. It's a coming-of-age story of a woman. And he's credited by many people who are not his fans that it is one of the most exquisite female coming-of-age stories written by a man. It's a story of a girl all the way to the end of her life and leadership and being the daughter of a king and becoming a queen. And it is, if you understand anything about Lewis's chauvinism, it is a stunning text in its beauty and quite redemptive, I think, of some of his other work. There's no Susan not getting into heaven anymore. There's a very strong woman who worked very hard to find her voice. Despite men, and he sort of writes a critique of his own style, frankly. So anyway, he's in this imaginative place. He just was not going to go on the radio and tell people how to do church or how to do Jesus, or Jesus wasn't. And we get the Screwtape Letters, and I read them every Lent. Most people I know who have read it regularly. Does that make sense? They're sort of like Screwtape people and other people who've heard of it and maybe heard a letter. But it's the kind of thing that if you kind of do it once, you just find yourself wanting to do it for other reasons. So for me, it's almost just like a cleanse. To hear that devil's voice in my own life and to read it in Lent, so the rest of the year I know whose it is when I hear it. So I was thinking about evangelism this afternoon and thought that it might, in fact, don't worry, other people, I'm coming back, be helpful to let you know that there is another Screwtape Letter that you may have perhaps been unaware of. And it is entirely about evangelism. And I finished it 10 minutes ago. So I would like you to take one. What took as long to write the letter was finding stationery at Staples that had a bit of a rusted tone and hue for where it was written. We can make available digital copies of this. And this is a bit of an experiment, and I do it wondering if the best way to start out talking about evangelism is to do it in a kind of an imaginative way. And then together, and this will be a discussion, instead of a presentation, we'll see if you find this effective. If you don't, you can walk out and then I'll just figure it out. If you come back, I'll know it wasn't a bad thing. If you don't come back, I'll know it was about this. So I've given it to you because some people like to read along. Also, feel free to just put it down if you're the kind of person that you just had a lot. My dear Wormwood. And by the way, I should say, if you're not a person who've read the Screwtape Letters, this is a very strange experience for you. Yes. The enemy is God. Screwtape is the uncle. He's the undersecretary, as he calls himself in the letters, of a kind of ministry of evil over the world. And he has a nephew who actually has just joined the demonic service. And he's taken, according to Lewis's commentary on this, he's decided to sort of help his nephew out. Think two people working for the CIA, the Foreign Service or something, and he's decided to sort of come alongside his nephew and maybe help him advance a little faster than he would without help. But he also gets very frustrated with him, being related as they are. Wormwood, of course, is the nephew. My dear Wormwood, it is a bit disappointing. After all the hard work so many of your superiors from headquarters have put into your training, to hear from you that your patient has begun reading and posting and talking about evangelism on your watch. You are right to be both ashamed and concerned about your own future in service of our Father below for this epic blunder. It is arguable that the whole purpose of the enemy's leaving humans on earth after they come into his camp is that they become evangelists. Evangelism isn't a mere human action like lying or drinking, nor is it a mere trained habit like storytelling or piano playing. Do you not realize that every follower of the enemy is an evangelist, whether they are aware of this identity or not? Have you forgotten what you were taught by your great professors, many of whom are my peers, that evangelism is what the enemy does with and through humans on earth? That the enemy is, in fact, the evangelist of the world, and any follower sharing in his disgustingly divine life is, by nature and vocation, the hands, heart, voice, and presence of the enemy. How dare you try to minimize your failures in the demonic arts by waiting to the end of your last letter to mention in passing that your patient is curious about the notion of evangelism? Your foolishness might well lead to losing this patient to the other side permanently. Do you know how many soldiers on our side have spent centuries successfully keeping patients unaware of their identity as light bearers of the enemy's light? While you have had this patient for only a month of her Christianity, and she is already figuring out that her life is now part of the enemy's evangelism of creation. You must understand the gravity of your failure and dread the level of your potential punishment. If your patient does indeed live into a life of conscious evangelism, it bores me, but I see that we need to review some basic tenets of your demonic training. Remember that once our enemy has won the devotion of any human, the disgusting relationship of unconditional love and belonging begins immediately. And with it, our immediate attempts to pull the human away from that eternal life. You would prove that we are in fact related if you were clever enough to wonder why the enemy does not, at that moment of new life, simply take the human out of the world into the enemy's heavenly and eternal kingdom and away from our influence and predation. It is a mysterious choice of our great adversary to leave his followers vulnerable to our assaults on their souls by leaving them in the world at all after baptism or after any authentic confession of a creator. It is, if you ask me, a deliciously demented decision of the enemy to allow humans to live out life in the world with the freedom to ignore, accept, or reject life with God, one moment at a time. The consensus position of the great scholars of our side is, of course, that our enemy delights, actually delights, if you can believe that, in watching his creatures grow in ugly fits and starts through cycles of sins and virtues in their relationship to their creator, grow in their relationships with other humans, and grow to know and love their creator in and through creation itself. It all seems like a terrible waste of everyone's time and a potentially and perfectly perilous situation for the human soul, thanks to us. But we have, for centuries, exploited the precarity of human love. The enemy actually desires that the human learn to love on his or her or their own, despite the time and freedom of earth that such a clumsy process requires. It is at all times both amusing and baffling for even the master devil to contemplate that the enemy would rather lose a soul to faithlessness than gain a soul by coercion. would rather abide with a soul stumbling in sin and shadows on earth than lock up safe each gained soul in heaven. We want to devour souls. The enemy wants them to want him. They are left on earth to love, to learn, and to live in harmony and justice with others and with the earth. In a word, they are left for evangelism. Now that she thinks of herself as an evangelist, your patient is on the brink, not of a new practice or mood or habit, but on the brink of embracing her eternal life and thereby finding her vocation on earth. Being an evangelist means that a human comes to believe that it is no longer he or she or they who lives, but that the enemy lives in them. The incarnation, you idiot, is the enemy's greatest act of evangelism. Curious about evangelism, your patient is on the brink of believing and, unfortunately, living as if the enemy's own life is her own. His love, her own. His mission, her own. His vision, her own. His power, her own. In light of your last letter, I do not trust and I do not care for your self-defensive assessment of her soul at this time. If she has truly come to see herself as an evangelist, I tell you that you have lost her to the enemy forever. Evangelism is not a job you can merely distract her from. It is an identity. It is baptism, that horrific event, fully realized. You are in serious trouble. But all is not lost. I am quite proud of the architecture of our approach to keeping humans from becoming aware that they are all evangelists. The so-called good news and or messenger of good news that all Christians are by their second birth. The core of our approach has been and continues to be leading humans into confusion about two words, evangelist and extrovert. Most of what Christians celebrate as evangelism is better described as extroversion, and their imprecision on this point has built our empire. This confusion is one of our great fruit in the face of the horrific reality of the incarnation and the human sharing in the incarnation through faith and sacramental practice. Narrow definitions of evangelism are the great poetry of our Father below. I cannot count the number of dark spirits on our side that have given centuries of strategy and strength to the effort to narrow the definition of evangelism. We have reached a level of such utter success that the enemy, against the enemy, that there are nearly none among humans who feel designed or delighted by the thought of being an evangelist. The whole conversation about the need for evangelism in public and hidden deep in human hearts is driven and directed by our grammar of shame, guilt, or fear of a dying church. Don't get excited about talk of a dying church. Sadly, with the enemy's life being the life of the church, there is, of course, no such thing as a dying church. Unless, of course, a church building or community has ceased to be a living church, which we work toward every day. Our best scientists on our side tell us that the majority of humans are not extroverts. The majority of humans are not conversationalists. The majority of humans are not debaters. The majority of humans take time for deep thought and response, well beyond the immediate conversations that spark the thought. Therefore, only a minority of people are extroverts. And even fewer are extroverts that have the skills and desire to speak on their feet to anyone about deeply personal matters. Once evangelism is defined, modeled, and celebrated, only when it is essentially extroversion, we win. Because then most of the Christian church will never feel comfortable, qualified, or inspired by evangelism. That is against most people's personality and soul's design. The enemy creates vastly different people with every kind of personality. Hell forbid the devil who lets any human consider and come to believe that extroverted evangelists are, in reality, as rare as extroverts of any kind. The truth, which you must keep from your patient, is that the enemy creates vastly different humans with wildly differing gifts for one purpose. That every person can potentially show the world what a human life living in God's life looks like. And that vision of a person living fully of God, horrific if you have ever seen it, is powerful enough to light a room, a home, a marriage, a friendship, a workplace, a prison, a hospital, a region, a religion. There is nothing more powerful than the observable fact of a life lost in God's love. Keep whispering to your patient that evangelism is a collection of things said or done. It will be your demotion beyond repair if she figures out that evangelism is this: being a Christian in love with God, who is listening for God everywhere to find and follow. There is no brighter light, no more powerful force, no more convincing testimony than the listening lover of God. The nonverbal autistic child, the dementia patient, the 2-year-old, the cycling young adult, the patient coach, the forgiving friend, the letter-writing godmother, the praying bus driver, the gifted painter, the passionate gamer, the faithful widow, the laughing lawyer, the failing student, the humming monastic, the healing addict. Anyone who lives life in reference to God is an evangelist. Every evangelist is a moon on which the universe sees the sun's light. Evangelists are potentially everyone. Hell help us if humanity figures that out. Our side's victories over the centuries in confusing humans about evangelism are legion. Indeed, the very fact that your patient was for a time a joyful Christian who did not think much about evangelism at all is a sure sign of our successes inside and outside the church. The fact that she is, as you wrote, exploring the topic of evangelism, as if it were for some exotic or inessential hobby, shows promise for your prospects to prey upon her soul and destroy her identity as an evangelist. Keep her in this mindset that evangelism is a set of actions or beliefs about the souls of others. Hell forbid that she come to realize true evangelism is primarily about her own soul and its unfolding salvation, not her work toward the salvation of other humans. Fill her schedule to keep her from Christian friends who are far advanced in the enemy's service and who know in their flesh that evangelism is what the enemy does through believers, not the other way around. Keep her from people who might teach her that salvation's sole agent is the enemy, not any human. Heap upon her imagination all the exhausting things one might do to change the beliefs of another person, or to help along, as it were, the salvation of others through ministries of one kind or another. Daunt her with the thought of all the people she could convert if only she cared enough. Remind her that she actually knows little about Christianity beyond choosing it. Embarrass her with their ignorance in social settings by moving her into conversations with deep questions about God or church. Draw her into relationship with people who are not believers in any God and fascinate her with their generally good intentions and more frequent commitments to kindness than hers. Dull her memory of her past insatiable curiosity about a creator. Remember that human memory is a fuel of all testimonies of grace. So muddle it, exhaust it, and bore it with the saturation of momentary news. Prove that you are a demon and help her forget in the dark what she saw in the light. Whisper that she has no right or might in sharing her feeble faith. Remember, the enemy's great weapon is wonder. A humble but healed human's openness to meet the enemy in all things. Our great weapon is worry, an anxious and ashamed human's mindset, that they are never what they need to be, never in possession of what they need to have, never in command of what they need to know in order to be a light of the enemy in the world. Make her worry that she cannot be a light in the world. You will be punished if she figures out that the enemy is looking for willing wicks to light, not Promethean gods to bring fire. Convince her of the lie that certainty is the certification for evangelism, and hide from her the truth that wonder is the way of evangelism. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Thoughts? Anyone have a breath?
These demons must be awfully afraid.
Of?
People who are interested in evangelism.
I think we have risen the temperature of an already hot place, for sure. Maybe. Anyone else?
So, define evangelism.
Right.
If you
In
would.
a sermon called The Weight of Glory, it's online, C.S. Lewis delivers it, and there are wonderful passages in that sermon. And at one point he says, do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? He says, remember your fairy tales. Spells are meant for releasing enchantments as much as they are starting them. And we need enchantments and spells to be freed, he said, from the materialism that has taken over the human imagination. So he said, yes, I am trying to weave a spell. And that was his way of saying, I'm not being simple. I'm not being explicit. Because the world is painfully, erroneously simple and explicit. But people of the gospel are people of narrative and story. Holy Week is a story. And those of you in here, depending how old you are, if you've lived under one prayer book or two, the prayer book we have now, and I know many people have great feelings about it, but hold those lightly for a minute. The 79 prayer book that guides us now centers, as many of you know, or I should say recenters this tradition on the Eucharist, and not just any Eucharist, but on Holy Week, generally, on the Triduum more specifically, the 3 days in Holy Week, with all the liturgies, and the Easter Vigil. Literally, the center of that book's heart is a moment in the Easter Vigil. Just picture that, just like Moses put the staff in them, when the Paschal candle is lit, the entire book, year, like concentric circles that come from water when you drop in a stone, everything explodes from that moment. That is that book. So in that sense, it's not even chronological or linear. It is an earthquake at the Easter Vigil. I say that because a lot of people say that the Eucharist was centralized. That's one reading of the prayer book that we have. The problem is when you say that, a lot of very bad things happen very quickly in the imagination. Because that's the one people's way of saying, I grew up saying morning prayer 2 Sundays a month, and now it's Eucharist, Eucharist, Eucharist. And the problem when you centralize Eucharist, very quickly you centralize a priest, which I do not believe was the intention of the prayer book. The intention of the prayer book was to centralize Holy Week and the Easter Vigil, and a moment in the Easter Vigil where we both become who we are again and begin the story again, and all of creation is renewed again, and we start our approach to the new heaven and the new earth again, actually, as the kids say. That to me is, you don't have to fall into clericalism if you think of it that kind of an earthquake, that is a moment in the vigil that we are all there for, a vigil of the baptized to baptize. The act of baptism is the kind of ministry of the Easter Vigil, not magic hands. But I do understand what has happened, that as Eucharists are more frequent and theology of the Eucharist and things like that have blossomed from the 79 prayer book, and I'm not upset about that, but I get a little nervous how quickly we actually can, and this is screw tape at work in the 79 prayer book. The 79 prayer, centralizing Holy Week is a complete disaster for the demonic. Because first of all, when you centralize Holy Week, you position a church like ours to be able to think more freely about buildings. And the utter earned collapse of respect and trust of institutions in the 21st century. We are post-institutional. That is a nice way of saying it. We have criminal action in every kind of institution. I don't care if, just name your group. Whether it's the Rotary or it's the Scouts or the Catholic Church, or, I'm right, we have earned, not just skepticism. I think in many cases we've just earned prison. So that's the fact. So the truth is, thank God we have a prayer book that actually centralizes a moment, not a place, but a moment that could happen in a place, and it changes the place. That where the Easter Vigil happens, Easter happens. And in most places it's in a church, but I love how unbuildinged the prayer book's heart is. That was prophetic. We would need a different, the 28th prayer book was just, we were blessing a lot of things, lots of blessing things, all kinds of things, lots of blessing things. So if you're losing things, there's like whole sections that you're not going to be looking at anymore, and that makes people sad. In our prayer book, the gathering of the baptized is the thing that happens somewhere. And when it happens somewhere, it affects everywhere. And the reason it can happen somewhere is because it has happened to everywhere. And as Rowan Williams would say in a very confusing way, which is most of what he says, the church exists for the awareness of God. Now, we could spend hours talking about the fact that I've been asked this more. I taught a course last year here on a whole course on Rowan Williams. And by the end, I knew people were really understanding Rowan Williams when they started to say, is he a universalist? I was like, now you're finally getting it. No, in a certain way, but yes, in a certain way. And what I mean by that is Rowan epitomizes to me that the most exciting and mysterious conviction of Anglican theology, which is that we don't believe in predestination. On the other hand, we sort of take, like the salad bar. I mean, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, we take a lot of that. And it's not just 5 points, okay? That's a long book, okay? There's some really great things in Calvin about mystery and things like that. But Rowan basically makes this argument that Jesus' death on the cross is for all and redeems all of human flesh and all of human life. So that's everything and everybody. On the other hand, we have a God who's not coercive. And their predestination is just a nice word for coercion. So if you didn't think of this before, the Anglican answer to are you a universalist? And I talked to a lot of people about evangelism, and I've had so many people basically say to me that the reason they love the Episcopal Church is we love everybody and everybody's going to be okay, and it just really reduces to universalism. So hear me say this: we are not universalists, not because we're jerks, but because from the Anglican perspective, universal destination of the soul of humanity is coercion. It is a corruption of the experience of freedom in your relationship with God. That's why Lewis's allegory, The Great Divorce, was his answer to is there a heaven and hell. Lewis he gave answers to that, but just kept saying he believed allegory was actually the only way to be faithful to Anglicanism on this question. Telling a story about heaven and hell, he believed was the best you could do to be most faithful to the Anglican answer to is there a heaven and is there a hell. And this is very important for evangelism to be able to answer this, by the way. Yes, there are both places. But just hold on to your medieval art for a second, okay? Just like put that in timeout for just 1 second. Dante, Milton, just over here, just for a second. I'm very excited about hell, okay? As an evangelist, this actually comes up in the dog park a lot, very quickly. Priests abusing children, hell, the Bible being bad news for everybody, but a certain shape of white conquistador. These are the things that come up. So please work on hell. If you don't have an answer, work on that. Okay? Because it's, you know this. I'm not telling you you don't know. That's like, I don't know why that's on the top, but there it is. So here's our answer. We believe that God wants us in relationship with God. And we are, at any point, we cannot lose our freedom in that. That's what Calvin was getting at when he called it an irresistible grace. But we wouldn't say that, because what Calvin means by that is you can't resist it. And Anglicans, we will not go off that cliff. We go right to the edge and just say, yeah, it's pretty amazing. So that's why we like that. But listen, to Rowan and to our tradition, it is resistible. That's how complete, let's use the terms of our times, God's commitment is to consent. Forever. This is the great kind of revolution going on in the Great Divorce. You can be in hell for 1 billion years and one day decide to get on the bus that goes to heaven. That is brilliant Anglican theology. We will rise in glory. We will enter the triune life through the second person of the Trinity. Just a little systematics, burn off some dessert here. But the Trinity is, at this moment in our time, a consensual, eternal relationship. In theory, one could opt out. So can you. Forever. Christ does not die on the cross because it's a certain moment he gives up his will. No. He chooses. So we're not universalists because I don't think that everyone's going to go to the same place, because I can't get 2 people to agree on the same gluten-free dessert. What violation to get 5 people to enjoy the same thing forever. So the problem with the word hell is all the baggage and the imagery and the art and the fear. But I love the idea that in this tradition, in the Anglican tradition, you never cross some line that you can't come back. You are chosen and you choose forever. We do not all have the same end because we do not all have the same beginning. And the human person, according to Aquinas, is made full through the sacraments and in resurrection is glorified. But you'll notice none of those things are erased, made uniform. No. The kingdom will be as weird as we are. In fact, weirder. It will be you glorified. Wow. Which generally, spatially means you like more. Whoa. And that which is destroying you now, as it says in the last chapter of Revelation, death and Hades were cast away. Everyone leaves that out in this image of the judgment. And they forget that line, that before all things end. That option is taken out. The reason there's no more crying and mourning is because there's no more death. You don't get okay with death. It is removed. Do we read that literally? No. C.S. Lewis, do you read the Bible literally? He said, no, I'm too busy taking it seriously. So Revelation is not literal. It's true. It is the core of our conviction. Its language is more than 50% of our liturgy. So if you're one of those people who gets creeped out by Revelation, get another tradition. I don't mean in a mean way. The Alpha and the Omega, The new heaven, the new earth, everybody's favorite bumper sticker. It's all Revelation, actually. Even the person that said they hate Revelation, like literally one day I met someone whose bumper sticker was something about new heaven, new earth, and the whole time I read Revelation, they're like, I hate that book. I'm like, and they're like, I bought it off Facebook. I'm like, okay, because it didn't have the citation on it. So, revel in the fact that we are not universalists, not because we don't want everyone to have joy, but because we want everyone to choose joy forever. And universal, there's a way in which you lose freedom in that. What is universal, Ron Williams says, is the efficacy of the crucifixion and the resurrection. That's the universal salvation. So do you see why he gets accused of being a universalist? Because if he's just like, well, Christ died on the cross for everybody, for all time. Yes. His answer often is yes, despite what the question is. Yes.
Improv, yes, and.
So that's a long way of saying that when someone says to you, my problem with religion or Christianity is that it's exclusive. I would just have you sort of lean into Ron Williams a little bit and realize that the purpose of the church is to communicate to people what has already been done for everyone. What has already been done for everyone. But the reality of sin and its effect on human choice is that many people cannot or will not choose that which has been offered to everyone. But the reason I am now a proponent of Anglican theology and not others is because I share Lewis's, and not just Lewis, we could go back in any century. By the way, every one of the patristic Latin and Greek fathers were all universalists. No one wants to talk about that, but that's the thing. There was a time when we were very comfortable talking about the universal efficacy of salvation. Even in a time of great sort of conversion and spreading of the church. These things can hold together, it just depends what you mean. But remember, what consciousness has brought to this particular tradition, I mean, we didn't exactly begin in that, and it's a theological answer to things, but we've grown. We've sort of surrounded a theology around one person's desire. But enough centuries have passed that I think the theology is quite solid. That we can, think of this, if you had to write down one thing that Rowan Williams says about, and I keep mentioning him because he both is a completely unique voice in our tradition in terms of his intelligence. I mean, I truly believe 200 years from now they're going to be talking about Rowan Williams. He's our, you don't have to agree with him, and he's actually in some very complicated places theologically. He's hard to, and his leadership as the Archbishop, I think, was just a bad way for him to spend 9 years or whatever it was. I don't think it was a gift match in many ways, but he still is a once in 100, once in 300 year theologian for sure. But I can't tell you the citation because it was in a conversation he and I had. He said this, that we're talking about definitions of the church. And here's Rowan's definition of the church. By the way, he's got about 100 million, but this is one he said. And by the way, this is the answer to the question, what is evangelism? Here's my answer. You were wondering where the midrash lands. Here it is. But he doesn't use the word evangelism. That's how it took a while to get here. But when you hear it, you will understand, I think, why I think this is what we should use as our definition of evangelism. Rowan Williams says, the purpose of the church is to form the kinds of people who are the kinds of people who can receive the gifts that God wants to give. Let me say that again. The purpose of the church is to form people into the kinds of people who can receive the gifts that God wants to give. Think about that. I mean, you can then talk about sacraments or preaching or pastoral care or prayer or silence or monasteries. All of it kind of falls under this very interesting framework. That while we're still on earth, why we're not beamed up as soon as you meet and agree to love God, is so that you grow into the kind of person who forever can freely receive the gifts that God wants to give. A simple thing, as a Catholic, I just remember it was like a month of CCD class, and if you don't know what that is, don't even worry about it, but it was like Sunday school, but it was on Wednesday. And I'm old enough that there was something called release time in America where public schools had to release their Catholics during school. to go get Catholic education for an hour by law. And the great thing about this in New York was I was in a town with like 2 Catholics, one me and my brother, and it was this WASP stronghold, frankly. I mean, I don't call it that now, but but the handful of Catholics would leave this public school and walk like the walk of shame 1 block to St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville, New York, where it was all white, all Christian, and no one had what I was told were ethnic names, which meant your name ended in a vowel. That's what someone actually told me. So that's the kind of town I grew up in, very waspy. And the Protestant church was on a hill across from town hall. It was amazing. Like town hall meetings were either held in the Protestant church or town hall. So this handful of Catholics, we'd walk down the street and we'd go to CCD, which was basically Catholic education. And what was funny was by law, we weren't allowed to miss anything in the curriculum. So those Protestants loved Catholics because when we left, they had to be in school and couldn't be taught anything. Kindergarten through 12th grade between 2 and 3 on Wednesdays because the Catholics had been released to receive Catholic education and we weren't allowed to be punished in the curriculum. So Protestants thought Catholic church was the best thing ever. Everyone should have one locally because from 2 to 3 o'clock, they had to be in school, sit in class, but could not be taught. Democracy is a really weird thing. But for a month, every Wednesday, we learned how to receive communion, which girls were told, like, don't stand like a slut. So it had to do with, like, literally how you stood. The guys were never told how to stand, but I was told, no, trollop. That was another word. I didn't know what that was. So I got all sorts of information about, like, all my extremities, what was going to be happening when communion happened. But I'm dyslexic, so I still actually can't remember. But it was something about one hand being over the other. And when you're dyslexic and the nun in front of you is like doing it, I did what she did, which is actually not what you're supposed to do. So I actually got time out more than once because I was like rebelling on the hand thing when really I'm looking at you and she's like, you're doing it wrong. I'm like, I'm doing what you're doing. She's like, don't do what I'm doing, like do this. So I'd be like, to my back to her, like, why are you turning it back to me? I'm like, I don't know. It's what you're doing. Because the whole thing was like, Jesus is coming in your hands, so don't mess it up. But it is such and I was terrified. Like, literally, by the time I came to receive communion, of course, I'm getting up there. I'm just like, I don't remember which it is. You can't look in front of you. You can't walk like a trollop. What does that mean? I don't even know. Because you're in the 2nd grade. So how do you not walk like a trollop in the 2nd grade? What is a trollop? I thought it was like a horse's gait. Like a trollop was a way to walk, not like. So don't trollop or gallop or whatever. Just walk. And I still never got the right left. But that's a perfect example of the mission of the church is to form people into the kinds of people who can receive the gift. That is an obscene example of the church failing to form me into a person who could just receive the gift that God wants to give. That's the most basic formation. Just form a person to receive communion. And don't be weird about it. So, Rowan's understanding of the church, think about that though. Imagine how that would change your vestry or your leadership as a lay professional in the church or an ordained person. And it was your job to every year say, are we helping people receive the gifts of God in the world? The sacraments are part of that. The Bible is part of that. These explicit forms of revelation are part of that. But in the dog park, in a museum, in hospice, are we forming people to receive grace everywhere? Yes or no? And then if we are forming them, everyone, then we can talk about language and invitation and welcome and bias and white supremacy. And so yeah, we are forming people. Well, who do you think are people? Oh, we think everybody. Okay, well, pick up your bulletin. I myself committed a sin, and it wasn't until I just read it out loud that I had completely gender binary things that you were either a man or a woman. And because of the glory of this particular room, I tried to fix that. And I'll go home and fix that. So we're all kind of a work in progress. That our assumptions are riddled with sin. Augustine is right about a lot of things. And just like we're not universalists, we also, it's not that you're okay and I'm okay. Because it's not true, it's not helpful. It's not that it isn't helpful because it isn't true. The reason that we don't teach that is because it is not helpful or true. That we do not have sin as a part of everything, or whatever your word is for that. And maybe there's a better word for that. You know, I wouldn't die for that word. I just think it's our tradition's word. But remember, if you want to be an Anglican about sin, because this comes up in the dog park too, is we go back to the Bible. There really is this threefold unfolding understanding of sin. And this does very well, actually, when you talk about it in the dog park. Because we're not fundamentalists about the 6 days of creation. What you say to people is, look, here's what I always tell people, like, maybe the story happened. I'm like, I don't know. There's like totally creepy cool things at the bottom of the ocean. We don't even know we're there. So God can do anything. Of course, there could be 7 literal days. Of course, the earth could be 7. Like, don't have the fights like that. They're like, what if the world is 7,000 years? I'm like, I don't know. It could be 7,000 years old. I have no idea. 15 billion sounds, in one sense, that sounds smarter to me. In another sense, I'm like, I have no idea. I don't even know what time it is. So, because my watch is always dead. So I have no idea. So I don't fight that battle. What I say to people is, I'm an Anglican, so this is how we read the scripture. We listen to it. And what you see in scripture is there's a story about the first break that you read about, which is the break between God and creatures, God and human beings. That's the first fault line. And we chose that. We weren't kicked out of the garden. That's a really mean way to read that. We chose that. Told exactly what life was, where we were. We wanted a different kind of life, and we got it. So as an Anglican, we would say we weren't kicked out of the garden. We insisted on it. Remember, Jews don't think of the fall the way we do. The fall of sin is the beginning of creation and the beginning of culture. There's a very, I'm not saying that it wasn't a problem, but it's treated very differently. There's lots of midrash about that. Like if they'd stayed there, we wouldn't have what any of us call culture. That's how we lived into being co-creators, as we kind of had to start over on the outside. And Jews have a lot less shameful view of that. It's more of an explanation of why we wound up doing so much stuff outside the garden than it is an explanation of why you suck. It's a different emphasis. What's the second generation of people, according to our story? Again, did it happen? I don't know. I don't even care. I don't care. It's helpful. In the second generation, Cain kills Abel. So now, what was a fissure, a break between us and God, we now have between us and each other. The story continues to unfold through the first few books of the Bible. The flood. Our choices then break our relationship with creation. So there's like a threefold, if you're an Anglican, we believe in a threefold set of fissures in the human soul. It's like California, there's fault lines. You know, I wouldn't build a house anywhere in California. I'd love to see that map. Like, don't build it right there, or a tall building right there, because there's a fissure, there's a weak point there. It may or may not shake, but if the state shakes, that something will fall through right there. So we believe the human soul is that. That's what original sin is. All that means is that with California, there are some weak points that when things shake, the things built even upon them will collapse. Our relationship with God was the first thing to break because of that, and after that, our relationship with each other breaks. And the third dimension of our brokenness, which we're only in the last century fully comprehending, our relationship with creation is also fractured. So what is the redemption? The redemption is trying to fill in those fissures in our state, that we would find strength in areas when things start to shake. So is there, people say it's original sin? I'm like, I don't know. In the dog park, I say, I don't know. But what I know is I feel those three dimensions at least. I feel them in my choices every single day. And I'm totally cool with the way it's talked about in the Bible. It works for me. That nails the three I feel every day. Did it all happen? I mean, I don't know, but something like that happened because that is what I feel. So I would die for its truth. Well, then how's it different than Aesop's fable? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, more people have lived and died by this book than in Aesop's fable. But as an Anglican, I would say, just like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Chesterton, I'll just keep going back, Madeline L'Engle, if you want to go that route. We all believe that if something is true, it's going to be true everywhere and in every culture and potentially in any story told by any person. So it's so ironic that fundamentalists love C.S. Lewis. I'm like, have you ever read C.S. Lewis? Have you ever read Mere Christianity? The Lord's Supper is like your salvation is kind of dependent on it. I get they've ripped that part out. They've also ripped out the part where if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then every religion is going to have a resurrection presence in it. Like if it happened to the world, you know what I mean? No one wakes up in the morning and writes a story and can get away from it. That's so different than you can't read Harry Potter in our church. Part of me is like, what are you people talking about? Because what if the resurrection is in Harry Potter? Well, it can't be. Well, if it can't be, then it didn't happen. If something happened to the world, it will happen to every culture and the imagination of every human person, whether they want it to or not. It will happen. It happened to the world. We are a historical religion as Anglicans. Historical. This stuff happened. And therefore, of course, Gilgamesh sounds a heck of a lot like Noah. We would expect that. If Lewis says one thing that's very funny. He talks about the Bible has some contradictions. He said if you took 4 people down to a police station and you put them in 4 separate rooms and asked them each for an account of something they just saw, he said if they all said the exact same thing, you know they're lying. But if each one tells an entirely different story, he would say the thing didn't happen. But somewhere between it didn't happen and they're lying is where all of human choice needs to be made about what's true. We should expect to find death and resurrection everywhere, in every season, in every leaf, in every Harry Potter story, in every Star Wars sequel. We should expect to find it because that's what truth is. If it's just ours, it isn't true. Now, I'm not saying you don't have your truth, you know what I'm saying? But truth itself, as an Anglican, that's what we believe. So the problem when we try to define evangelism narrowly, as warned in this letter, is you wind up taking people like me, and I began by saying that this was an odd thing for me to write this book, and I mean it in this regard, that I am an extrovert. And my great concern in being asked to write a book called What is Evangelism is I think my personality and set of gifts and weirdnesses is maybe 1 to 5% of the population. And I don't mean that like I'm on top, like I'm the 1%. I'm just saying my combination of talking and energy and extroversion, I haven't gotten anything to faith yet, neurology, pathology, we don't need to get into my whole, family story, but there's stuff. And I was the youngest child in a family that just, by the time I was 18, 2 members of my immediate family had already died. I'm a storyteller. I make people feel better. We haven't talked about Jesus yet. These are all just things I do when I get up in the morning. And when I got very worried when I was asked to write this book of evangelism, I thought, oh my gosh, people think that what I do is evangelism. That's terrifying. That's like 1 or 5% of the population. So I have to write a book that is not about me, because Screwtape would love for me to tell you that if you go to a dog park, it takes me, I love Amtrak rides. I walk the train looking to sit next to somebody. Other people are just trying to find the seats they're alone. And when someone is looking for a seat, I'm like, you can sit here. I'm just like, sit here. As they're sitting down, I'm like looking at them, I'm praying, I'm just like, yeah. Bring it! Now remember, as an Anglican, I'm not saving their soul. But I am committed to be the church that understands evangelism. Evangelism is forming people into the kinds of people who can receive the gifts God wants to give. What he said about the church, I really believe, is what we, at best, how we define evangelism. Evangelism is living your life in such a way that you are helping, serving, accompanying, abiding with, which doesn't mean talking, with people. You're loving people, which could be locked up in a room in your prison cell praying every day. You are relating to people in a way that you giving your life to the effort that people would be formed into the kinds of people who can receive the gifts that God wants to give, including salvation. I want to help the person who's sitting next to me to the best of my ability, which means telling God to do it. If Christ has come to earth into the human flesh, so the human flesh can come into Christ, which means entering the Trinity. So when I pray, this is crazy. We believe crazy stuff. Prayer is becoming fully a participant in the Trinity through the second person of the Trinity. Now, not practice, die, and then all the good stuff happens. No, now. In this mortal life, as it says in the first collect for Advent, now, in this mortal life, let us cast out darkness. Now. You don't cast out darkness, the Trinity casts out darkness, which you enter through your baptism. what? In the Trinity? This is about Amtrak. People are just like, what? I'm like, yes! Yes! That's what's happening! Yes! So when people are like, the evangelism is offensive, I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. It can sound insane. You get that response. But people, I think, can realize, if you're practicing true Episcopal evangelism, quite often people just step back and they're just like, well, one person said it one time on an airplane, it was like, you really want me to love life? I like feel, we were talking about Star Wars, you're like, I feel this like tractor beam to like love life. Like, you don't even know who I am, lady. Why do you care? You want me to love my life? I was like, yeah. What else are you doing? What are you doing now? Like, and then I was just like, I don't even know what I'm doing now. Because then he's like, when I got on this plane, I knew what was happening, and I don't know what's happening. And that's and I'm sure there was a born-again Christian sitting next to me, like, this is why we hate Episcopalians. Like, because when they try to be evangelists, all of a sudden someone was yelling in row 4F, I don't know what's happening anymore. And I'm like, mystery! I don't know either! What has certainty gotten you? And he's just like, damn right, nothing. I'm like, exactly. I'm like, the pilot, certainty. But you and I, mystery. I want to help me. I'm in the process right now of trying to become the kind of person who can receive the gifts God wants to give. And that's actually all I want to talk about with anybody in the dog park or anything. But 70% of you are introverts. In fact, as the Episcopal Church, according to Renewal Works, actually a lot more of you are introverts. So that's why I said what I said there about the experts on the other side. Oh my gosh, if we keep calling evangelism basically extroversion, there are a bunch of you who are going to feel like someone is telling you that you're right-handed, but if you really love Jesus and go to a workshop and download a group of things, you can be left-handed. You just keep trying. That's how stupid it is to tell a group of introverts to get a buddy and go to Starbucks and practice evangelism. If it's defined by you come back and then we all share our stories. I was in Campus Crusade for Christ in college. Surprise, surprise. I like always like I never run into a room and say, where are the moderates? Like, that's never what I do. So having spent 4 years as a born-again evangelical Christian who went on mission trips with bullhorns, I was the person literally on the boardwalk that was just like, the end times are coming. Literally. So I love those people, but like the feeling was not usual for many reasons. But moving as an evangelist who is committed to the Episcopal Anglican theology. Remember, we're a container for Anglican theology. In fact, it's more than that. Ian Douglas, who's the Bishop of Connecticut, has a wonderful phrase. And it's going to upset some of you, but just let it sit. He said, the Episcopal Church is the Catholic tradition in the vernacular. That's a complicated phrase, but it's a powerful one if you're a church historian or theologian. I would say it's spot on. That the Episcopal Church does not have its own catechism in that sense. I mean, we do have a catechism of the faith, but what makes it so powerful is there's a lot of universals in there with the Catholic lowercase c community. Your Orthodox friends, your Catholic friends, what they read in the catechism is just ours is a lot shorter, but it's not different, which I think is wonderful for communion. But think of that we are the Catholic, that is to say that a global tradition of Christianity that's trying to stay global, trying to stay together, trying to live sacramental life. That's what we are in the vernacular. We're understanding about gender and sex and class and race, and we're failing and trying all the things, right? So it is like an asymptote, like we're getting closer and closer, but sometimes we're never going to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect on these things. But oh my gosh, if you're one of our marginalized people in our church, you really hope people get a lot less terrible at certain things quickly. Like, can God at least be sought for help in that? And I as a white person, that's why I wake up and say, I don't know how to sort this out as a white, privileged, educated, English-speaking Christian in America. But I do know that that my call as a Christian is to wake up every morning and just say, God, please let me become the velveteen rabbit. What does it mean to be loved? You become real. Okay, which is why it's so wonderful that we begin our year in Advent looking toward that moment when we will, at the Easter Vigil, change the world every single time, because we need to be renewed like that. Because every year we're better at when you're not healing white supremacy, you're actually getting better at it every day. You know, when you're not healing from racism, you're actually getting better at racism. As we all know, there's no neutral, I'm not working on that now, so I'm not getting better, but I'm not getting it worse. People who wake up and suffer because of that every single day, I'm getting better waking up tomorrow in a world where I can somehow get up and have breakfast and walk the dog while people are being subject to incredible suffering and oppression. So I'm actually getting better at handling that. And everyone I talk to who isn't talking about that by 9 o'clock in the morning is getting better at not talking about that. So I'm getting better still at racism than I am getting healed from it every day. One day I would love to even get close to just the clock passing, getting better and better and better and better and better at racism, which I am every second. And every now and then I feel like I'm getting sort of a little bit better at justice. But oh my gosh, even in my life, there's such a gap. And then we think of times in your life where you're not even trying to get better at it at all. Some people are like, yeah, I really work on race and Lent. I'm like, wow. I mean, that's a privilege to say, like, I'm going to pick this. On the other hand, it's 3 o'clock when I say to someone, like, wow, you really suck. Meanwhile, I haven't thought about race until I was thinking about how much they suck at it by 3 p.m. Right? So I've been getting better at it since I woke up, but all of a sudden they're upsetting me. So if you have to leave here, write in your hand a definition of evangelism is that you are the person who walks around the world that does two things. One, you long for yourself and other people to become the kinds of people who know how to receive the gift God wants to give. We literally are all teaching people how to receive communion. Ministry information is teaching people how to receive communion. Put it on a t-shirt. That is what ministry is. Wherever you find it, in whatever form it comes in. And the actual communion we have is sort of the kind of the ultimate form of receiving communion. But what does it mean to walk up and have a receptive posture to the grace in the world? The other thing I'll say, that when you see it in the book, was very funny. The person, someone I know very well, got the draft and called me and left a message and said, I need to talk to you about the draft. They sounded concerned. And when I got on the phone, I said, okay, I had the draft. They said, page 1. And at the first line, I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be hard. And the first line of my book is, evangelism is listening. And it's alone. It's the only sentence in the first paragraph. But the reason the person called me is they know me. They're like, who wrote this book? Like, I love you so much, but like, this is not the sentence I thought I would see anywhere in your book, and certainly not as the first sentence. I was like, I know, see, that's what happens. You like marry Lisa Kimball and you grow. Before I got married to this particular Episcopalian in the church, Google her, I would have never written that book, and I would have never written that line. I would have said, evangelism is talking. But I try to write a book for our times and not fall into the screw tape problem, which is to think that I am evangelism. I am a quirky, odd, extremely rare form of communicator who has found my calling in Amtrak. The question for the church right now, for each of you, is you have to bring the whole self. You have no right to time out any part of the person God has made you to be. And every part of the person God has made you to be is exactly the evangelist you have to be, not because of coercion, because of joy. So we need a class called Evangelism for Introverts. Because that's 70% of our denomination. And even more of our leadership. The Episcopal Church is very weird like that. We have priests who don't like people. It's not as common among our lay professionals. I'm just going to be honest. I meet more lay professionals in our church that have, like, I just meet a lot of, I'm sorry. I'm not. I mean, it is a tradition of hierarchy in our church to love humanity. It's just people you kind of have a problem with. And but it's humanity that they're suspect of. The generalizations, the categorizations. They just know too many weird people doing holy work that they know a lot of people can't even sit next to you for more than half an hour without some kind of social contract violation. But lay professionals know how to just roll those folks in, because we're trying to form people into the kinds of people who can receive the gifts that God has to give. That's very different than being the kind of leader that's trying to explain to you how the faith works. So my great hope, and so the book, there's parts of the book that talk about things I've done to give different views of evangelism, but like one of the things is like I got on a scooter in DC in a cassock and surplice, like all the stuff. I don't care really at all about vestments. I really don't. Investments are made for people, not people for vestments. I think that's a verse. If it isn't, go look. I hope it's in there. The idea is in there. They exist for, so of course, when I get on a scooter and ride around the White House, I do cassocks, circle, I have the stole that I'm going like on the 3rd speed on the scooter and it's all flying all over the place and it's amazing. You know, one person's like, are you an Anglo-Catholic? I'm like, what? If Anglo-Catholics had like the big cheese piece that, you know, people wear in Wisconsin football games, I would wear that. Whatever religion it is that you just wear whatever you need to wear for people to be like, what are you talking about? I will wear that thing. But heaven forbid any of you think evangelism is getting on a scooter yelling about noon Eucharist outside the White House. It is Satan that says to you, that's the real hardcore varsity evangelism, and you will never be that. That is screwtape. That is demonic. I hope you find whatever it is God has given you the gift to do, and you love it as much as I love riding a scooter around the White House screaming about noon Eucharist. I tell people a miracle is happening. I'm like, right there. Where? I'm like, there, St. John's. When? 12:10. A miracle. Yes! Yes! Every time! I'm there, I saw it! This is a fact-based religion I hold. Come see it! I have learned this conversation. This guy's like, all right, I'm like, happen now! Are you getting another offer for a miracle? That is a food truck! So it's that. I said, we have to also feed you. It's not a, I looked, I was like, kebab, but is he offering you a miracle? I could be wrong. You have 20 minutes to find out. If I'm wrong, you are only as foolish as a person who tried out a miracle for 20 minutes. Is that so crazy? And then people come. But again, the problem with people like me who show up at conferences and tell these kind of stories is a church of 70% introverts is like, and by the way, can I just have a minute to even process your story about being on a scooter just for a second? Maybe when can I even process that? So we are dangerous talking about evangelism. So the book is about listening as the verb of, and VTS here too, in terms of how we're going to do evangelism, listening. And listening is physical. It's not even just hearing, because people who can't hear would be like, what about people who can't even hear? Listening is looking, but it is calm and peace and space. And in that space, a God who is not neutral to your being an evangelist, being the light that your baptism has filled you with, just being that, listening will let you find out in any situation how to be that person. And it could be that you're in the dog park and you don't even go over to the people, that you sit there and you pray for each person for 10 minutes and leave wondering, has anyone ever prayed for that woman for 10 straight minutes? I actually don't pray as much at the dog park for people as I should, because most of the time I go to the dog park, if I'm not talking to anybody, it's just like me and the dog, I try to catch up with all the people I said I've been praying for and haven't been. I log like at least an hour or two a week of just having to be honest. And how many people, sometimes I should sit and be like, oh my God, I told her, I emailed her, I texted her, texted him. And there's just such a list of people I've fallen into. I'm praying for you, I'm praying for you, I'm praying for you. Like, you know what, ever a priest ever write you an email, they put that cross, plus, whatever, next to their name? That is a thing. In the 19th century, if a priest blessed the paper on which, at a time the church was very into that a priest could actually bless things, and you can't if you're not ordained. If you blessed the letter, you put the X next to the name to let someone know they were receiving a letter that had been blessed. Give a card to anyone who puts the plus on the email that knows that's why that's there. It's not a title. It's not Jesus plus me. No. I wonder how many people have actually, before they hit send. I feel like you should not be allowed to type that plus unless you bless that darn screen. Then I'm cool with it. I want everything to, but it's a perfect example of we can reach a point where we ask ourselves, look, how, when I get up in the morning, do I, me, figure out how to form the world into a group of people who can receive the gifts that God wants to give? That diversity, which is a terrifying thing to Screwtape and the devil, is if each, so we should have 30 or 40 kinds of evangelism in here. But as long as you all think there's like a hardcore kind and a varsity kind and a JV kind, and you keep nodding, and your bishop said you had to go to this thing, not tonight, but you had to go to something, or you went to the something, or you downloaded the thing and you gave it out, and you looked at the list, you're like, ooh, what can I do with my community? Like prayer walk, like that's not scary, we'll do a prayer walk, we'll just walk and pray. And you look down the list of the things that you can do, the techniques. And my book really doesn't have that many techniques. Now, those are important, by the way. There are techniques of cooking, techniques of marriage, and they're helpful. But there's a difference between techniques and practices. And the practice of evangelism is listening. And then there are techniques of how to listen according to what your Myers-Briggs is and your Enneagram is and everything else. And we are losing a lot of that in the church because, let's go back to Michael Curry. He, like me, is just I'm not like him, but like him, we're just not the average kind of communicator. We're not better than anyone else, but we're just not average. He's not the average kind of communicator. But if we keep thinking that is like the ultimate, immediately the devil is giggling. As soon as he becomes on a ladder, and either whether he's far from you or not that far from you, as soon as it's a ladder, we lose. I'll end with this before I ask you another question. Yo-yo Ma. I was a Sunday school teacher at the Harvard Church, the University Church, and I was dragged in because my father died in the first few weeks of college, and someone was smart and had me come to church, and when I got there, asked me to teach Sunday school or be there for Sunday school, whatever it is. There's always someone up to something. That's what CS always says. So I got kind of dragged to Sunday school, and there were these two children, and their parents came to pick them up, and I got to know them for 2 or 3 weeks, Nicholas and Emily, Ma. And they were like, we want you to meet our dad. I'm like, okay. So I met their mom, who's this really cool woman, and I meet their dad, and hi. He told me his first name. I thought it was weird. I didn't know anything about anything as an 18-year-old coming from a kind of just a working class, I don't know, like fancy music, whatever. I asked him what he did for a living. He said music. And I'm thinking anything from like wedding singer or, I don't know, what does it mean to do music? So they asked me over for lunch, this family brunch. His house had like instruments, so I was getting the music thing like he's way in. That became clear. So over time, I went back to my roommates who were all these fancy. My roommates were Exeter, Groton, St. Paul's, and Iolani. Those are my 4 roommates. If you know what those schools are, and I, not every school apparently is PS with a number. So I came and told them. They were like, "What is happening? You asked him what he does for a living?" I was like, his handshake. I'm like, his hands were like, oh my gosh, yes. So I did figure out who he was and became a part of that family for years. But I remember the first time I saw Yo-Yo play the cello in person, and it was the 2 of us. And he just picked it up and played what I know is his favorite. If you want to know what Yo-Yo's favorite piece is Bach cello suites. That's his favorite. He keeps coming back to it in his career. If you follow him, there's lots of versions of that. And Emily and Nicholas, who at that point were 6 and 8, were there. And when he went to play, it was funny, they were looking at me. And he sat back. Yo-Yo lies down with the cello. I don't know how else to say it. I'm not a musician, but that's, if you've been with him, like, it just looks like he lays down with it. And when he pulled the bow, I'd never heard of the Bach cello suites. I didn't know what they were then. And if you know how the rhythm of the suites begin, I started weeping. I'm not a crier. I'm not like a really good Irish Catholic. I've been through like family funerals without crying. Yo-yo played for maybe 30 seconds. I saw it hit the floor. That's how I knew I was crying. Drop, 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 drop. When it was over, I went over and thought that Emily and Nicholas take bets of how long it's going to be before someone cries. It was like one of their party games, which is why they were watching me. And I was like, you know what I'm going to cry? They're like, everyone cries when Daddy plays the cello. But they were like, but you didn't last at all. I'm like, I know. It was like, why did I cry? Because Yo-Yo Ma is an evangelist. I had never in person seen a person fully realizing their gift. Someone whose life had, as much as I'd ever seen, received the gift God wanted to give. So it had been so received that there was nothing else left. It was literally watching God's gift given received. And the vision of it, it didn't matter if you played the trumpet or painted. I'd never been with a human person who had fully received their gift. And I couldn't breathe. Yo-Yo is a deeply Christian person. He was confirmed at St. Bart's in New York. He became an Episcopalian. He has a very fascinating life story. Most of it he keeps very private, but he's a deeply Christian person who doesn't talk really much about God. So he's a perfect example. Of course he's an evangelist to me, because I've seen it. But I leave with you that thing. What if we thought about evangelism not as a set of practices alone, though Yo-Yo would tell you there are practices of music. He's the most practiced person perhaps that a cello has ever known. He's not a normal person. I know a lot about his life growing up. He did not have a normal life. A certain kind of life made Yo-Yo Ma, and it was not a casual relationship to music. His kids are very normal considering how he was raised. But so that practices and techniques are key. But what if we just came to a place of saying evangelism is you finding your gift, which means that a group of people have formed you into the kind of person who can receive the gift that God gave you. And then you being that. That's why people want to talk to me about Jesus, not because I'm an evangelist, but because talking about Jesus is my cello. Does that make sense? Like, that's just the thing. When I'm doing it, it's the thing I was given to do. That's why it's contagious. Not because talking about Jesus is contagious. But people like me and Michael Curry, people like us, we confuse people that evangelism is talking about Jesus. No, the life fully realized will take the breath away of the person sitting next to you in Amtrak or an airplane or at a funeral or in hospice or in your bed. Someone witnessing a human life. Because remember, as Anglicans, we believe Jesus redeemed humanity. Jesus, the dude, it is an image of one human life fully realized. We're actually advocates of humanity, if that makes sense, as a tradition, not of God. Christianity is the focusing on a human life fully restored and then gifted, and then you get Yo-Yo Ma. So I hope whatever it is that you do it like Yo-Yo Ma plays the cello. Maybe it is talk about Jesus or preach or do exegesis. But it literally could be the way you put your feet on the floor. Mother Teresa came and was a commencement speaker, and I got to talk to her with all of her people. And Mother Teresa, I heard her describe putting her feet on the floor that morning. And I'm like, that's why you're Mother Teresa, actually. Because her description that she can't wait to put her flesh onto the earth that God made, that she will return to in dust and she will rise from in glory. And all through the power of the Holy Spirit that she feels in her feet as they touch the ground. And the first thing she says she does in bare feet is grab the earth for its beauty and its redemption. Think of your toes as grabbing the earth. Like, you could start to cry just watching someone do that. That's evangelism. Walking away saying, like, I'm still talking about that woman grabbing the earth with her toes. Not because she talks about Jesus, but because you can't unsee someone that's a fully human person. So if you're not a fully human person and you're not in a relationship with God and you think going to the dog park talking about Jesus is going to do anything, that is just lies from the pit of hell. And that's manipulation, that's pandering, that's propaganda, and it's demonic because you're lying. If prayer isn't changing your life to the point that people can experience it, stop saying it is. If you're not praying for people, stop saying I'm praying for you. The devil laughs with us. Because the truth is that everything else you say, you are not experiencing the thing that you're offering, which is tragic, not just simple, it's tragic. So what's the revival for evangelism? The revival is to the Christian life, right? Evangelism, you want to be an evangelist? Go deeper and deeper and deeper in your relationship with God until one day you actually just show up and grab the earth with your toes and someone starts crying in front of you because they have yet to have ever seen a person fully living as a human being. We can, those of you who've been online, you feel free to stay. Those of you who feel they need to get up and leave, feel free to do that. I will stay and answer questions. One of our volunteers will bring the books to the door, so you can take one before you leave. But I just want to give you the freedom to move. My question for those of you who stay is, has your definition of evangelism, whatever it is now, tonight, is it something you have been told or something you have discovered? That's a question you can sort of just leave with, but I'm also curious if any of you just have an answer to that. Is your definition of evangelism right now something you've been told evangelism is, and maybe you're trying to do it and maybe you're not? Or is it something that you have created? I'll just be curious. Because you, by the way, you can be faithful in both. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being told something. I was told Jesus is God, so being told something doesn't mean it's a bad thing to just believe it. Anyone?